Today we finally have a proper review of the RTX 4070 Ti Super because we finally have a proper RTX 4070 Ti Super. And what I mean by this is I have confirmed with benchmarks now that the MSI Ventus 3X, even with its latest VBIOS update, is underperforming versus at least the Zotac model that we have here. Now, one key difference that I did find between both these models is that the Ventus does include a 2 8-pin to the PCIe Gen 5 connector adapter in the box, as opposed to the Zotac model that includes 3 8-pins to that PCIe Gen 5 connector, which I also had to then rerun all my RTX 4080 numbers because I accidentally used that 2 8-pin to PCIe Gen 5 connector in the previous benchmarks that I did. But regardless, also using a 3 8-pin for the Ventus 3X did give it a very slight boost in performance in some titles. It was still, though, overall quite a mess with this card. The numbers aren't fixed. The VBIOS doesn't fix it, at least for this particular model. And as it stands, I'm going to leave those numbers in today's results so you can think about buying a different model for the 4070 Ti Super to get the performance that you should be getting. However, what we need to do right now is put the pizza aside, put the burrito down. Let's get into those benchmark numbers where you guys also, by popular request in the previous video, wanted to see the RX 7900 XT numbers as well as the 4070 Ti vanilla numbers. So we're going to throw those in. Let's start off here with Alan Wake 2, 1440p high settings. And what we see right here is the 4070 Ti Super is coming in blow for blow with the 7900 XT, but the 4080 still outperforms quite significantly, over 10% performance over the 4070 Ti Super, but at least with this Zotac model, you are getting performance of where it at least should be, and that's in between the Ti vanilla and the 4080. And this does continue over now to Fortnite as well, where you can see that that Ventus was making it looking like you just weren't really getting much of an upgrade over the 4070 Ti, which actually isn't really the case here. You are getting a decent boost. It's just no boost that's close to the 4080 either. So that is performing quite well at 1440p and 4K on ultra settings in Apex Legends. However, moving into Cyberpunk showed one of the worst differences yet for the 4070 Ti Super versus the 4080, where performance was close to around 20% better on the 4080 in this particular title at both 1440p and 4K ultra settings. Now, one thing as well with this title is the 7900 XT does do phenomenally well here too, especially considering its recent price drops, though we will make a separate video dedicated to the 7900 XT because that has a lot of merit, especially just for raw gaming on its own. And here's where the 4070 Ti Super is performing closer to the 4070 Ti in this particular title, even whether it's a Super Ventus or a Super Zotac OC. But moving on to Returnal, here is where it does fall back in the middle of that vanilla versus the 4080, and it does beat out the 7900 XT in this title. Moving on to Starfield, however, this is a different story. This is AMD's sponsored title, and here is where the 7900 XT does lead the pack, at least at 1440p, but then does fall behind at 4K to the 4080, and the 4080 is a substantial chunk faster than the 4070 Ti Super, and the Ti and the Super kind of all perform actually in a similar range. So with those raw gaming numbers aside, we'll get onto the ray tracing very soon, but we can see here, the magic sauce in Ada Lovelace is actually got a lot to do with that level 2 cache size, and we'll pull up the specs here and the prices of the Ti versus the Ti Super versus the 4080, and what we can see here is you're getting the same price point as the Ti vanilla, but you're not getting that extra level 2 cache that you're getting on the 4080. And in certain titles, especially Cyberpunk, for example, we saw a massive increase over the 4080, more than the CUDA core count versus the 4070 Ti Super. And that, like we saw in the 4070 versus the 4070 Super review, this architecture definitely, a lot of its magic comes from that level 2 cache size. And so you're actually not getting any more of that with this 4070 Ti versus 4070 Ti Super. But you are getting an extra 4 gigabytes of VRAM, and you are getting a bigger bit bus, and that is increasing the power consumption somewhat, depending on the title, which we'll get onto right now with the power consumption numbers. We did see in Fortnite actually a power increase that matches very close to the 4080, but then if we did Returnal with our undervolting benchmarks, we saw numbers that were sort of in between the Ti and the 4080. However, that being said, another problem that I had with this card was that it just didn't undervolt. I had to power limit it to undervolt it, but that dropped the performance significantly as opposed to a manual undervolt that I usually do on RTX 4000 series cards. So something is a little bit off with the 4070 Ti Super to begin with, and maybe that's what MSI with their Ventus model was struggling to get right. At least Zotac with the OC model here, they've got everything right out of the box, which is the majority of people who buy a GPU. So the card does perform well. It's just that I kind of personally expected a little bit more from it. I actually expected it to kind of be closer to that 4080 in the benchmarks than be closer to the 4070 Ti or somewhere in between. I'm kind of left with, after seeing the 4070 Super numbers, being much more impressed with that card than the 4070 Ti Super. But that being said, the 16 gigabytes of VRAM, I'm going to stop here and do a little bit of a different segment here for the 4070 Ti Super. If you know that you need 2 encoders, that's if you're a streamer or you're doing video editing, the 2 encoders on the Ti and the Ti Super and the 4080 do come in very handy versus the 4070 Super and the 4070. It's actually, at this point in time, I'm confusing myself with how many 4070 series cards there are, but there are some differences between them. And so if you are a creator and you can utilize 2 encoders, then the 4070 Ti Super does carry that just like the 4070 Ti did. And that's personally why I have a 4070 Ti in my video editing rig, because it's that lowest price card from NVIDIA that has those dual encoders. And they do make a big difference for when you're, say, recording and you're editing videos and you're utilizing both those encoders at the same time. And now you've got an extra 4 gigabytes of VRAM and that bigger bit bus. So if you can utilize that for, say, 6K video editing or AI features, then this is where the card is actually going to make more sense for someone who wants to utilize it for things outside of gaming than for gaming itself, which is kind of weird because I thought this card coming into it would be the best of the super refreshes for gamers, but it's looking like it's actually going to be the best for people who are looking for more professional at-home desktop applications, sort of like the prosumer, than it is for gaming. So anyway, let's quickly get on to the ray tracing numbers, where we'll show here that Alan Wake 2 shows a massive difference between the NVIDIA cards and the AMD cards. It's because they got now the pathing update with the ray tracing in this game, and it performs so much better on NVIDIA cards. And as opposed to, say, for instance, Returnal, the ray tracing is better on NVIDIA, but it's not as big as the differences in Alan Wake 2. Now, if you want to go for ray tracing, I would go for NVIDIA. It's pretty obvious that the performance difference there is not just better, but it's also better value for money. Also, you get the DLSS 3. And so that can make a big difference if you want to get a good visual experience on a single role-playing game. You don't care a whole lot about a bit of extra input latency. That's going to be a good option as well. Anyhow, getting all that out of the way, it's time for me to put on some hairworks, because this review was actually probably the most frustrating GPU review I've done up until this point in time. And that is because we started off with the Ventus model, which obviously it's got some problems that still exist. MSI have made an update saying this isn't going to hit the models that hit the shelves. They're going to have no problems. Yet the V-BIOS that I tested in my previous video is the same V-BIOS they're being shipped with in the models at the shelves. Now, if someone goes and gets a 3X 4070 Ti Super Ventus, do let us know if it does come with the 2 8-pin to 12-volt PCIe Gen 5 connector, because that is certainly part of the issue. But also on top of that, the Ventus model, I wouldn't buy that. And so my recommendation after seeing these numbers here today still stands on that. Also, I did see with the Zotac model here, it's getting everything right, at least out of the box. And so the model here does perform quite well in terms of its temperatures and especially in terms of its noise. It was whisper quiet. They're doing a great job of making a card that's also a lot smaller than the 4080 Zotac Trinity, for example. It's actually a normal size GPU here with this 4070 Ti Super Zotac Trinity OC White Edition. So this model here is doing a good job. And if you want to go out and just buy it at MSRP, it's actually around that price. And so at least in the US, I'm checking the MSRP prices. This card is hitting around those prices. So that's good to see from Zotac. They've done a good job here with this card. And if you've seen the numbers and you know what you're getting into with the 4070 Ti Super, then it's going to make sense at this $799 MSRP in the US. And here's where we're going to talk about the pricing, because this, just like the 4070 Super, is going to be a recommendation that's exactly on the same lines. And because I checked the prices over in Japan, for instance, and I checked the prices in Australia here for the 4070 Ti Supers, it's funny to see. Well, it's actually no surprise that in Japan, the top selling card right now is the 4070 Ti Vanilla. So that's coming in a little bit more expensive than the 4070 Super and significantly cheaper than the 4070 Ti Super. And that's just catapulted to the top of the charts. And so that is my recommendation. Look at the prices where you live locally on not just the newer super cards, but also the original 4070 Ti and the original 4080, and see what they're going for. In the case of Australia, I would not get a 4070 Ti Super at its retail price. The cheapest I can find is $1,500 Aussie dollars, and then I look for a 4080 and that's coming in at $1,600 Aussie dollars, an extra $100 Aussie dollars, which is like 60 something USD, and you're getting all that extra performance. No brainer. So if you're in Australia, just rush out and get a 4080 if you are thinking about getting a 4070 Ti Super. However, if you're in the US, you can see just like the 4070 Super, that's coming in right around its MSRP, and this card is too, and that's cheaper than the cheapest 4080 I can find. That's over $1,000 US, and then the cheapest 4070 Ti is now only about $20 cheaper. So if you're in the US, it makes a lot of sense just to go get a 4070 Ti Super versus the older models, and same with the 4070 Super. So these Super refreshes in the US, from at least what I see, they're much better value than they are in Australia and Japan, and probably a lot of other countries in the world. And so ultimately my recommendation here is look at the charts and then just take a look at the pricing locally of the cards where you are and see what the best deal is. You guys should know that. If you're in Japan especially, you've got Kakaku.com, that'll just tell it for you. Usually just look at the top selling cards, and people aren't stupid. There was actually an AMD card right at the top there, and that just sold out because it must have been so cheap. But that'll get removed very soon, and then the 4070 Ti Vanilla is going to be the top selling card in Japan. Anyhow, guys, with all that aside, the 4070 Ti Super is probably the weirdest GPU launch I've taken a look at least from recent memory. And it's met equally with one of the weirdest recommendations I've ever made. And it's so weird, this kind of pricing discrepancy. This did not happen when the 2060 Super and 2070 Super were launched, for instance. They were a blanket recommendation. They were just better value than the 2060 was, the 2070 was. This time around, it's really, depending on where you live, take a good look around. In Australia, it's a no-brainer to spend the extra $60 US dollars, or 100 Aussie dollars, and get the 4080. That's a no-brainer. And then in the US, the 4070 Ti Super is making a lot more sense because it's actually priced at its MSRP. And the 4080 is significantly more expensive. And the 4070 Ti is not a whole lot cheaper. So there's that. But there's also the RX 7900 XT. Now, we're going to be making the next video dedicated towards that card. We've got it right here. It's the ASRock. And it's looking really good, especially at its current price point too. It's come down significantly in price recently, so we've got to talk about that in a separate video. But ultimately, when it comes to it, I've found a lot of people, they either want to buy NVIDIA or they want to go buy AMD. And so if you're in the NVIDIA camp and you want the 4070 Ti, then you've got a lot to think about. And it's also dependent on where you live. So hopefully this recommendation has served you well, this dynamic variable refresh rate recommendation, but that's the best I can come up with. Honestly, it's the best I can come up with. Anyhow, with all that aside, hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to hit that like button. Also let us know in the comments section below what you think of the 4070 Ti Super. Love reading your thoughts and opinions as always, and I'll catch you in another tech video very soon. Peace out for now. Bye.